Have you ever stared into the glowing rectangle of your smartphone and felt, even for a split second, that the world inside the screen was somehow more vivid, more pressing, and honestly more real than the physical room you were actually sitting in? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a deep, fully immersive dive into the mind of one of the 20th century's most provocative thinkers, the French sociologist and philosopher Jean Baudrillard. We are going to unpack his terrifyingly accurate theories on media, technology, and our completely screen-saturated world. It's a trip into a landscape where the boundary between the virtual and the physical doesn't just get a little blurry, it completely vanishes. So, let's get into it. You've probably heard Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "The medium is the message," right? Well, Baudrillard took that idea and pushed it to an absolute, chilling, almost apocalyptic limit. He argues that the screens we hold and the networks we're constantly plugged into aren't just neutral pipes passively delivering information to us. No, they have fundamentally altered reality itself. The medium has become so all-encompassing that we literally cannot separate the technology from the content anymore. And worse, we can't separate the content from our own lived experiences. The message itself has completely imploded. To figure out how we got to this point, we really need to talk about the consumer society. Baudrillard spotted this massive cultural shift. He realized we don't buy things primarily for what they do anymore, their actual utility, or even for what they cost. Think about it. You aren't buying a $7 artisanal latte just for a hit of caffeine. You're buying it to broadcast a very specific social identity. Commodities have basically become a language. It's an entire social system driven by the endless, dizzying play of symbolic value. Richard J. Lane's foundational work on Baudrillard is incredibly helpful for navigating this complex terrain. His analysis really lays bare how our everyday consumer world is, at its core, an illusion. But it's not an illusion like some magic trick where there's a guy hiding behind a curtain. Instead, it's a closed symbolic system, and it's one that we all actively, willingly participate in every single day. We've traded in a reality that was based on physical material production for a new reality based entirely on signs. Now, in traditional, old-school thought, signs and symbols pointed to real, tangible things. A picture of an apple pointed to a physical apple you could eat. But Baudrillard argues that in our current media-saturated age, those signs have completely detached from their original anchors. They don't point to reality anymore. They only refer to other signs. Just think about algorithmic curation on social media. Digital ideologies are actively organizing your identity, your emotions, and your desires, and it's all based on a self-referential loop of data, likes, and shares. The real world, it's left way behind in the dust. This exact realization marks Baudrillard's famous break from traditional Marxist thought. Earlier theorists were hyper-focused on the factory floor, on physical labor, and on capital. But Baudrillard looked around and realized the postmodern era is governed by something else entirely. It's governed by models, by digital codes, and by what he called a structural revolution of value. Our society isn't organized by the production of physical goods anymore, but by the endless, frantic reproduction of information and imagery. Which brings us to the absolute beating heart of Baudrillard's philosophy: simulation. Now you have to understand, simulation isn't just a fake. It's not a counterfeit watch or a simple lie. It is an operational reality that functions so perfectly, so seamlessly, that it actually replaces the real thing entirely. The boundary between the model and the real is completely wiped out. The simulation generates its own real-world effects. It's a massive system running on its own internal logic, totally independent of the physical world it supposedly represents. So how exactly is this simulation spoon-fed to us? Through mass media. But Baudrillard doesn't look at media as just newspapers or standard television channels. He describes them as miniaturized terminals. Just let that phrase sink in for a second. Television screens and digital networks are acting like magnetic tapes, spooling directly into our consciousness. They interiorize these transmissions right into the screen of our own minds, turning the human subject into a completely passive node in a vast information network. We aren't consuming the media anymore. The media is processing us. We used to have this quaint belief that old media mirrored or reflected reality. A nightly news broadcast was supposed to be a clear window into the events of the world. But postmodern media does the exact opposite. It devours reality. It neutralizes all meaning by bombarding us with so much information and so many conflicting narratives that everything just flattens out into this autonomous realm of pure cybernetic noise. The medium and the real dissolve into one another until we literally cannot tell the difference. And when the simulation finally devours reality, we are plunged headfirst into hyperreality.
This is a state where the technologically constructed model actually becomes more real than the physical reality it was based on. Everything from curated digital interfaces to heavily edited reality TV becomes a consumable reality that we just accept without blinking. In hyperreality, the map comes before the territory. We actually judge the real world based on how well it lives up to the simulated version on our screens rather than the other way around.
To really grasp this total implosion of meaning, Baudrillard uses a brilliant astrophysical metaphor. He says the media is a black hole. Just like a black hole absorbs all surrounding light and energy, mass media absorbs all meaning, communication, and information. It doesn't project clear messages outward, it collapses them inward. It's a state of total cultural entropy, where this massive overload of information actually results in the complete and utter destruction of real meaning. To help visualize this abstract collapse, Baudrillard points to the Mobius strip. In our digital age, the sheer proliferation of models and codes creates this continuous, spiraling, circular system. There's no clear inside or outside, no definitive beginning or end. The whole concept of cause and effect, the simple idea that A causes B, just evaporates. Events on the internet become endlessly entangled in themselves. They loop back and forth in this field of pure simulation, where linear history just doesn't apply anymore. So what happens to us, the public, staring into the face of this black hole? He writes that it's an opaque nebula whose growing density absorbs all the surrounding energy and light rays. Baudrillard proposes something deeply counterintuitive here. He suggests that the masses don't resist this massive media manipulation by starting a political revolution or taking to the streets. Instead, they resist through a profound, impenetrable apathy. Think of the blank, glazed-over stare of endless doom scrolling. By just absorbing all the media hype and giving absolutely nothing back but silence and indifference, the masses actually neutralize the system's attempts to manipulate them. And this dynamic brings us squarely into the realm of postmodernism. This is an era defined by what he calls radical semiurgy, which is really just a fancy way of saying an absolute, overwhelming avalanche of signs and images. It's a landscape where all our old binary oppositions, true and false, good and bad, real and imaginary, are completely obliterated. The old boundaries between high art and low culture just implode. In this state, truth and morality become entirely subjective, totally relative, and ultimately undecidable. We're just left floating in a universe of pure information without an anchor. Baudrillard described this deeply disorienting, chaotic landscape as the postmodern carnival. It marks a massive historic rupture. It's a space where the traditional rules of the game are openly parodied, where conventions are transgressed just for the fun of it, and where society basically revels in its own deconstruction and inversion. It's a world playing with the broken pieces of a collapsed reality, finding this strange, ironic joy in the absolute relativity of the hyperreal. Okay, so how do we actually navigate this? Well, Baudrillard's answer is surprisingly fatalistic. He calls it the object strategy. Because we are so completely overwhelmed by the network, he argues that the object has already won. Our fascination with screens, images, and commodities is total. So instead of trying to fight the system rationally, he says the only strategy left is hyperconformity. By becoming more object-like ourselves, by pushing the system's crazy logic to its absolute absurd extreme, we might somehow find a strange new form of power from deep within the matrix. Which leaves us with a profound and frankly pretty unsettling thought to wrap up on. We exist right now in a world where the primary directive is just to stay connected, to keep scrolling, to keep endlessly generating data. If, as Baudrillard suggests, reality has truly vanished beneath the seductive, glowing surface of the virtual, are you really consuming the simulation on your screen today? Or is the simulation actually consuming you? Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Baudrillard's thought. Until next time, maybe take a second to question, not screen in front of you.